Nora Gable's hands would not stop shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. She was crouched beneath a stranger's traveling rug in the corner of a carriage that did not belong to her, clutching a leather-bound book against her chest as though it might leap from her grasp and betray her on its own. The wheels rattled over uneven stone. Somewhere behind them, the wreckage of an overturned mail coach still smouldered at the base of a ditch, its axle broken clean in two, its driver nowhere to be found. She had not stopped to ask questions. She had seen the ledger fall from a strongbox thrown clear of the crash, and in the desperation that comes only to those who owe more than they can ever repay, she had taken it. She had meant to sell it, or pawn it, or use it to bargain with someone, anyone, who might forgive her family's debt to the mill owner in Oakhaven. She had not meant to end up here, hiding in a carriage that had stopped for her on the highway out of what she'd assumed was ordinary charity. She had assumed wrong. The door had barely shut behind her when the man across from her spoke, and his voice was not the voice of a kind traveller offering shelter from the rain. "Where," he said quietly, "did you get that?" It was not a question. Nora looked up and found herself facing a man who filled the carriage the way a storm fills a valley, not through size alone, though he was tall and broad-shouldered beneath a coat of dark grey wool, but through some quality of stillness that made the air feel heavier around him. His jaw was set hard, his eyes the colour of iron under cloud, and though he had not raised his voice, something in his tone made her pulse climb into her throat. "I found it," she said. "On the road, there was a coach, overturned, and no one. You found it." His gaze dropped to the book in her hands, then rose again to her face, weighing her, measuring her, the way a man might measure whether a horse could be trusted or ought to be put down. "Do you know what that is?" Nora shook her head. She did not read well. The letters on the ledger's cover meant nothing to her, only shapes, and the pages within were worse, rows of numbers separated by strange marks that looked like no arithmetic she had ever seen taught in the village schoolroom. "No, sir," she admitted. "I only knew it looked valuable. I thought perhaps I might return it. For a reward." Something shifted behind his eyes, so briefly she nearly missed it. Not anger exactly, closer to alarm, quickly smothered. "Give it to me." She hesitated only a moment before holding it out. He took it from her with the same care a physician might use lifting a wound, turning it over, flipping through several pages by the dim light of the carriage lamp swinging on its hook. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened further, and Nora saw his gloved fingers press white against the leather binding. "Who else has seen this?" he asked. "No one. I swear it. I only just found it, not a quarter-hour past, when the storm—" "Was anyone with you? Did anyone see you take it from the wreck?" "I was alone, sir. I always walk that road alone. It's the shortest way to—" "To where?" "Home. Oakhaven Village." He said nothing for a long moment, only studied her the way one studies a puzzle with a missing piece, and Nora became suddenly, painfully aware of the state of her own appearance, her cloak patched at the hem, her boots worn through at the sole, her hands rough and reddened from years bent over a loom that no longer earned enough to keep her family fed. Whoever this man was, he was not accustomed to sharing a carriage with the likes of her. "You will not be going home tonight," he said, finally. Nora's stomach dropped. "Sir, I beg your pardon. I meant no harm. I only—" "This is not a punishment." He set the ledger down beside him, though his hand did not leave it, as though he feared it might vanish the moment he looked away. "It is a precaution, for your own safety as much as mine." "I don't understand." "No," he said, and for the first time something almost like weariness crept into his voice. "I don't expect you do. But that book you found on the roadside is not lost property, Miss." "Gable. Nora Gable." "Miss Gable." He said her name as though testing its weight. "That book contains information that certain powerful men in this country would do a great deal of harm to recover, or to destroy. The coach you found overturned did not lose its wheel by accident." The carriage rattled on through the rain-soaked dark, and Nora felt the small, ordinary shape of her evening, a walk home, A cold supper, the familiar ache of hunger she had long since stopped remarking upon, collapse entirely away from her, replaced by something enormous and frightening she could not yet name. "Who are you?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, gathered from the fineness of his coat, the crest half hidden beneath his collar, the absolute authority with which he had claimed the ledger as though it were owed to him. "Montgomery Vansford," he said, "Duke of Oakridge." Nora had heard the name before, always spoken in lowered voices, always followed by some warning about his temper, his ruthlessness, the cold reputation that preceded him through every village within 3 counties. She had never expected to hear it from his own mouth, in the dark, with a stolen ledger between them, and the rain hammering down outside like the whole sky meant to drown out whatever came next. "Then, Your Grace," she said carefully, "what happens to me now?" Montgomery looked at her for a long moment, and something in his iron gaze had not yet decided the answer. The study at Oakridge Manor was larger than any room Nora had ever stood inside, and colder too, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling on every wall, crowded with books bound in leather so dark they looked almost black, and the windows behind the Duke's desk let in a grey morning light that made the whole room feel like the inside of a storm cloud. She had slept, if it could be called that, in a small chamber off the servants' corridor, under lock, though no one had told her so plainly. A maid had brought her a plain grey gown that fit poorly at the shoulders, and a breakfast she had barely touched. Now she stood before Montgomery's desk, with her hands clasped in front of her, trying not to let them tremble, while he studied the ledger she had found on the highway, as though it might answer him if he stared at it long enough. "Sit," he said, without looking up. She sat. He turned a page, then another. His brow furrowed at whatever markings filled those columns, and Nora watched him work in silence for what felt an unbearably long stretch of time, until at last he set the book down and fixed his attention fully upon her. "Read this line to me," he said, turning the ledger to face her and pointing to a row near the top of the page. Nora looked at the marks. They swam before her eyes, familiar in shape only insofar as she recognized letters existed, and these were meant to be some of them. She had never been taught her letters properly. There had been no money for schooling, not after her father's illness had taken what little the family had, and her days since the age of 9 had been spent at the loom rather than at any book. "I cannot, Your Grace," she admitted, heat rising in her cheeks. "I never learned to read." Something crossed his face then, an expression she could not name, not quite disappointment, not quite relief, some tangled mixture of both. He sat back in his chair and regarded her with new consideration. "You truly have no notion of what you were carrying?" "None, sir. I only saw it was fine leather and thought it might fetch something at market, or perhaps buy back my family's good name with Mr. Aldridge at the mill." She twisted her hands together. "I never meant to steal from anyone living. I believed it lost." "It was lost," Montgomery said slowly, "by a courier who never reached his destination. A courier carrying records that certain men in London would burn half this country to keep hidden." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and Nora found herself studying the line of his shoulders beneath his dark coat, the rigid, controlled way he held himself, as though restraint were something he practiced, the way other men practiced swordplay. "Then you believe whoever caused the coach to overturn is still searching for it," she said. He glanced back at her, surprise flickering across his features, quickly suppressed. "You are quicker than I expected." "I am not stupid, Your Grace, only unlettered. There is a difference." A faint sound left him that might, in a less severe man, have been the beginning of a laugh. It vanished as swiftly as it came. "Indeed there is." He returned to his desk and sat once more, folding his hands atop the closed ledger. "Here is what I know, Miss Gable. Whoever lost that book will not rest until they recover it, or ensure its finder can never speak of it. If you return to your village, you place yourself in danger, and you place your family in danger alongside you. If I release you, and word spreads that a village girl handled documents belonging to men of consequence, the consequence will fall upon you swiftly and without mercy." Nora's chest tightened. "You mean to keep me here?" "I mean to keep you safe," he corrected, though the distinction felt thin to her ears. "Until I understand the scope of what I hold and who threatens to reclaim it, you will remain at Oakridge under my protection." "As your prisoner?" "As my ward, for the present." He said it firmly, as though daring her to argue the word. "You will be given honest work, a wage, and a room of your own. You will not be locked away, nor treated as a servant beneath notice. But you will not leave these grounds without my knowledge, and you will speak to no one of the ledger, the coach, or the manner in which you came to Oakridge." Nora searched his face for some sign of cruelty, some flicker of the temper the villagers whispered of whenever his name arose, and found instead only a tired, guarded watchfulness that unsettled her more than open anger might have. "What manner of work?" she asked finally, for there seemed little use resisting a man who held both her fate and the local magistrate's ear in the same closed hand. "My private library wants cataloguing. Half these shelves have not been properly ordered since my father's time." He gestured to the towering cases surrounding them. "You will assist my librarian. It will keep you close, and it will keep you occupied, and it will explain your presence here to anyone who asks." "I cannot read the titles, Your Grace." "Then you will learn to recognize their shapes well enough to sort them, and in time, perhaps, more besides." He rose again, signaling the conversation's end, though something in the set of his mouth suggested he had not fully decided what to make of her yet. "You will begin this afternoon. Mrs. Pemberton will show you the West Library and explain your duties." Nora stood, curtsying stiffly, though the gesture felt foreign on her, borrowed from a life not her own. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Gable." She looked back. "Whatever you may hear said of me in this house," he said, "know that I do not make idle threats, nor idle promises. You are safe here so long as you do exactly as I ask." She held his gaze a moment longer than was proper, searching for the truth beneath the warning, and found she could not tell yet whether to believe him. By the 5th day, Nora had learned the shape of Oakridge Manor well enough to walk its corridors without losing her way, though she had learned little else besides. The library work suited her better than she had expected. Mrs. Pemberton, a stout, patient woman with ink-stained fingers, had shown her how to sort volumes by the color and pattern stamped upon their spines rather than by their titles. And Nora found a strange satisfaction in restoring order to shelves that had sat neglected for years. That morning, she had been sent across the courtyard with an armful of estate ledgers bound for the steward's office, a task that ought to have taken no more than a few minutes. She had not gone 10 steps before raised voices stopped her in place. "You will explain to me," Montgomery was saying, his tone low and cutting, "how a shipment of grain meant for the Eastern tenant farms arrived instead at the mill in Thornby, 3 counties distant from where it was needed." The man before him, a red-faced estate manager named Hollis, wrung his hat between his hands. "Your Grace, I can only think there was some error in the delivery instructions, some confusion with the—" "Confusion does not explain a discrepancy of £40 sterling between what was ordered and what was invoiced." Montgomery's voice carried across the stone courtyard, sharp enough that several servants passing nearby quickened their steps to be elsewhere. "Either you have been careless with my accounts, Hollis, or someone beneath you has been dishonest with them, and I confess I have little patience remaining for either possibility." Hollis opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked thoroughly wretched. Nora, still standing at the edge of the courtyard, with the ledgers heavy in her arms, felt a familiar prickle of recognition. She had spent enough years keeping her own family's meager accounts, stretching a few shillings across a week's worth of bread and coal, to know the particular sound of numbers gone wrong. She should have kept walking. Every instinct told her so. Instead, she found herself stepping forward. "Your Grace, if I may." Both men turned. Hollis looked at her as though she had lost her senses entirely, appearing uninvited in a conversation so far above her station. Montgomery's expression was harder to read, though his eyes narrowed slightly with something that might have been curiosity. "You may not," Hollis began, but Montgomery raised a hand, silencing him without so much as glancing his way. "Speak," he said to Nora. Her heart hammered, but she had already committed herself, and there seemed little use retreating now. "I do not know the particulars of your grain shipments, Your Grace, but I have carried these ledgers to the steward's office every morning this week, and I noticed something odd in yesterday's entries. The figure for the Eastern delivery was recorded twice, once under the tenant accounts and again under a separate column marked for the mill. If the clerk copying the entries mistook one column for the other, the shipment itself may never have gone astray at all, only the record of where it was meant to go." Silence settled over the courtyard. Hollis stared at her, mouth slightly agape. Montgomery's gaze had sharpened considerably, fixed upon her now with an intensity that made her wish she had said nothing. "You believe the grain reached the correct farms," Montgomery said slowly, "and the error exists only upon the page." "I cannot say for certain, Your Grace. I have not the learning to read every word in those columns, but numbers I understand well enough, and duplicated figures rarely mean what they first appear to mean. It would want no more than an hour to walk the eastern farms and confirm whether the grain arrived as it should." Montgomery turned to Hollis. "Send a rider to the eastern tenants within the hour. If Miss Gable is correct, you will revise your bookkeeping practices before the month is out, and you will thank her for sparing you a wasted afternoon accusing an innocent clerk." Hollis, pale now rather than red, bowed hastily and hurried off toward the stables, muttering something Nora did not catch. She remained where she stood, still clutching the ledgers, suddenly uncertain whether she had helped or overstepped some boundary she did not yet understand the shape of. "You are not afraid of me?" Montgomery observed, once Hollis had gone. The remark caught her off guard. "Should I be, Your Grace?" "Every soul on this estate is afraid of me. My own steward will not meet my eye when I raise my voice. Yet you walked into the middle of a dressing down to correct me in front of him, without hesitation." "I did not correct you," Nora said carefully. "I only offered what I noticed. And forgive me, Your Grace, but you did not seem a man in need of protecting from the truth, even an uncomfortable one." Something shifted in his face again, that same fleeting expression she had glimpsed once before in his study. Not quite a smile, but some loosening around the eyes that suggested one might exist beneath the surface, rarely permitted to show itself. "Most people believe protecting me from uncomfortable truths is precisely their duty. It makes for exceedingly poor conversation." "Then perhaps you have simply never asked the right people," she said, and immediately wondered if she had gone too far. But Montgomery did not reprimand her. He studied her a moment longer, the courtyard quiet around them, but for the distant clatter of a groom leading horses toward the stable block, and something in his gaze had changed since the ledger had first passed between them in the storm-battered carriage days before. It was no longer merely suspicion, nor merely the wariness of a man guarding a dangerous secret. It looked, Nora thought, uncomfortably close to interest. "Return to your duties, Miss Gable," he said at last, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. "And should you notice anything else amiss in those ledgers, I would hear of it." She curtsied and continued on toward the steward's office, her pulse still unsteady, aware that something small and unspoken had shifted between them in the space of a few minutes in the cold morning air, though she could not yet name what it was, nor whether she ought to welcome it. 4 days passed before Montgomery summoned her again, and when he did, it was not to his study but to the stable yard, where a modest carriage stood ready with 2 outriders mounted alongside it. "You are taking me somewhere," Nora said, more statement than question, as a groom helped her up into the carriage. "To Oakhaven," Montgomery said, climbing in after her. "I wish to see your village for myself and to confirm certain details of your account." Her stomach turned over. "You do not believe me." "I believe you well enough. But belief and certainty are not the same coin, Miss Gable, and in matters such as these, I have learned to spend only in certainties." He rapped twice upon the carriage roof, and they set off down the long drive, the two outriders falling into place before and behind them like an escort more suited to a visiting magistrate than a simple errand. The journey took the better part of an hour, and Nora spent most of it watching the countryside pass beyond the window, hedgerows heavy with late blackberries, fields stubbled gold from the recent harvest, the familiar bend in the road where she had always paused to catch her breath on the long walk home from the mill. It struck her strangely to be returning to it now inside a nobleman's carriage, guarded like something precious, rather than trudging along on foot as she had done 1,000 times before. Oakhaven appeared much as it always had, a scattering of stone cottages around a market square, a church with a crooked steeple, stalls selling turnips and woven baskets and bolts of rough cloth. But there was something different in the way the village looked back at her. Heads turned as the carriage rolled to a stop near the square. Whispers passed between the stallholders. Nora felt her cheeks burn as she stepped down, painfully aware of how out of place she must seem beside the Duke of Oakridge, dressed now in a gown far finer than anything she had ever owned. "Walk with me," Montgomery said quietly, offering his arm in a gesture that felt entirely unnatural to them both. "We are here to observe, not to draw more attention than we already have." They moved slowly through the market, Montgomery pausing here and there to exchange a few words with a stallholder, his manner considerably softer than the cold authority Nora had witnessed in the courtyard days before. She realized, watching him, that he was not merely making conversation. He was listening, weighing every response, every glance thrown their way, with the same careful attention he had given the ledger's cramped columns of figures. They had nearly reached the edge of the square, close enough now that Nora could see the crooked chimney of her family's cottage rising above the garden wall, when Montgomery's grip on her arm tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Do not look directly," he murmured. "Continue walking as though nothing is amiss." "What is it?" "There is a man standing beneath the yew tree by the churchyard wall. He has been there since we arrived, and he has not once looked at the church." Nora's heart began to pound, though she forced her steps to remain even, her gaze fixed politely ahead, as though admiring a stall of dried herbs. "You believe he watches my family's cottage?" "I believe he watches for you," Montgomery said, "or for anyone who might come asking after a lost ledger. A man loitering with no business, dressed too well for a labourer and too plainly for a gentleman, in a village where every soul knows every other soul by sight, he stands out to anyone troubling to look. And I have spent a great many years learning to look." They completed their circuit of the square without incident, though Nora's nerves remained taut the entire while, and it was only once they had regained the carriage and put a mile of road between themselves and Oakhaven that Montgomery permitted himself to speak plainly again. "Your instincts were sound," he said. "The ledger's owners are searching, and they have narrowed their search to your village already. Had you returned home as you originally intended, you would likely have been found within days." "And my family?" Nora's voice caught. "If that man watches our cottage, does that mean they are in danger too?" "For the present, they are in less danger than you might fear. Whoever sent that watcher does not yet know for certain that you hold the answers they seek, only that you were the last soul seen near the wreckage. Should they grow desperate enough, or patient enough, that may change." He paused, choosing his next words with evident care. "It is another reason you cannot yet return. Your absence from Oakhaven, so long as it is not explained, protects your family more than your presence would." Nora stared out at the passing hedgerows, thinking of her mother's worried face, her younger brother's endless questions, the debt still hanging unpaid over their heads, regardless of what danger now circled them from an entirely different direction. "This is a great deal to carry, Your Grace, for a mistake made on a rainy road." "It was not a mistake," Montgomery said, and something in his tone had softened further, losing the clipped edges she had grown accustomed to. "You did nothing wrong, Miss Gable. You found what any desperate soul might have taken, in circumstances that gave you no reason to suspect its danger. The fault, if fault exists, lies with the men who allowed something so perilous to go missing upon a public road in the first place, not with the girl unlucky enough to stumble upon it." It was, Nora realized, the closest thing to comfort he had offered her since the night they met, and though his voice remained measured, careful, entirely controlled. Something in the way he said it settled a small portion of the fear lodged beneath her ribs. "Thank you," she said quietly. Montgomery did not answer at once. He only watched her a moment, his iron-grey eyes unreadable in the shifting carriage light, before turning his attention back toward the window and the road unwinding steadily beneath them, carrying them both further from Oakhaven and whatever danger now watched its quiet streets. The decision came only 2 days after their return from Oakhaven. Montgomery summoned her to his study once more, and this time his expression carried none of the composed authority she had grown used to. He looked, if anything, unsettled. "We depart for London within the hour," he said, before she had even fully crossed the threshold. "My steward received word this morning that a stranger made inquiries at the Oakridge Village Inn, asking after a girl matching your description who had lately come into the Duke's household. Whoever searches for that ledger has traced you here." Nora's blood ran cold. "Then my family. Word has already gone to your mother, arranged discreetly through a trusted tenant, explaining nothing beyond your continued safety and employment. It is the most I can offer without drawing further attention." He rose from his desk, already reaching for the traveling case at its corner. "Oakridge is no longer secure enough to guarantee your protection, nor mine, while that book remains in my possession. London affords more resources, more allies, and considerably more places to disappear should the need arise." The journey south took the better part of 3 days, broken only by brief stops to change horses and rest at coaching inns along the way, and it was somewhere upon the second day, with the countryside rolling past in long stretches of pasture and stone wall, that Montgomery reached beneath the carriage seat and withdrew a slim volume Nora did not recognize. "A primer," he said, setting it upon his knee. "Nothing dangerous, nothing coded, simple verses." Nora eyed the book with something between longing and embarrassment. "You mean to teach me to read, Your Grace?" "I mean to occupy the hours between here and London usefully, and it occurs to me that a woman who can read may prove considerably more useful to me than one who cannot. Should our search for these conspirators require the examination of documents, I cannot always be present to interpret myself." He opened the primer to its first page and turned it toward her. "Besides which, it seems an unkindness to leave a mind as quick as yours locked out of every book in my library." She flushed at that, unsure whether to take it as compliment or simple practicality, and bent her attention to the page he indicated. The letters swam before her at first, stubborn and unfamiliar, but Montgomery proved a patient instructor in a manner entirely at odds with the reputation that preceded him through every village in the county. He did not raise his voice when she stumbled over a word, nor grow impatient when she asked him to repeat a sound 3 times before it settled properly in her memory. He simply waited and corrected her gently, and moved on only once she had mastered what came before. By the second evening, somewhere beyond the halfway point of their journey, Nora found herself able to sound out short sentences unaided, and the small triumph of it loosened something in her chest she had not realized was drawn tight. "You are a swift study," Montgomery said, watching her work through a passage about a fox and a farmer's henhouse. "Swifter than I expected." "I have simply had a great deal of practice guessing at numbers, Your Grace, and letters are not so very different once one learns their shapes." She glanced up at him, emboldened by 3 days of close quarters and the strange, unhurried intimacy that travel seemed to create between two people otherwise unlikely to speak so freely. "May I ask you something?" "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "The villagers speak of you as though you were carved from stone. Cold, they say, merciless. Yet I have seen very little of either quality since the night you found me on that road." She hesitated, then pressed on regardless. "Why do you allow such a reputation to stand, if it is not the truth of you?" Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window and the darkening fields beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual measured control, replaced by something quieter, more worn. "My father ran this estate into considerable difficulty before his passing left it to me. Debts, poor management, tenants left to suffer for his negligence. I inherited a duchy on the edge of ruin, and a great many men circling it like carrion birds, eager to profit from a young duke they assumed too grieved and too green to defend what remained of his inheritance. His jaw tightened slightly. I learned very quickly that gentleness invites exploitation in men of that character. A reputation for ruthlessness, whether entirely earned or not, kept the vultures at bay while I rebuilt what my father had allowed to crumble. It became easier, in time, to let the reputation stand unchallenged than to explain myself to people who had already decided what manner of man I was. "That sounds a lonely sort of armor to wear," Nora said softly. "It has served its purpose." But something in his tone suggested the admission cost him more than he cared to show, and for a moment, his gaze met hers with an openness she had not yet witnessed in him, unguarded and faintly uncertain, as though he had surprised even himself with how much he had revealed. "Read the next passage," he said abruptly, nodding toward the primer still open upon her lap, and the moment closed itself as quickly as it had opened. Nora returned her attention to the page, though her mind lingered a while longer upon what he had said, turning over this new understanding of the man seated across from her. Not cold by nature, she thought, but armored by necessity, and perhaps, after so many years alone behind that armor, no longer entirely certain how to set it down even when he wished to. The carriage rattled on through the gathering dusk, carrying them both steadily toward London, and toward whatever waited for them there. Mayfair greeted them with none of the warmth Oakridge had come to hold for Nora over the past fortnight. The townhouse Montgomery kept there was grand, certainly, its rooms tall and handsomely furnished, but it carried the chill of a place seldom lived in, its dust sheets only recently drawn back from the furniture, its fires laid but not yet warmed through by long use. "We shall not stay longer than necessary," Montgomery told her, as a small staff of servants hurried to prepare rooms and lay a proper supper. "London affords me contacts I trust, men who can help trace the ledger's rightful owners and the conspiracy it exposes. But it is not a city that forgives carelessness, and I would have us gone from it the moment our business here concludes." Nora had little time to settle before that business found them. On their second morning in the townhouse, a footman arrived at the breakfast room bearing a single folded letter upon a silver tray, delivered, he explained, by an unknown person who had vanished into the street before any question could be put to him. Montgomery's expression darkened as he read it. He passed it to Nora without a word. The hand was neat, deliberately anonymous, the message itself brief and chilling in its restraint. "Your Grace, I understand you have come into possession of a certain ledger belonging to interested parties. Its return, quietly and without further inquiry, would serve you considerably better than the alternative. You have 3 days to consider the wisdom of discretion. A reply may be left at the White Hart on Jermyn Street." There was no signature. Nora turned the paper over, searching instinctively for some further clue, and found none upon the reverse but a faint watermark visible when she held it toward the window light. "Your Grace," she said slowly, "may I see that again?" Montgomery handed it back, watching her with sudden attention as she angled the paper against the glass, tracing the ghostly pattern pressed into its fibers. A stylized crest, a lion rampant beneath a scrolled banner, so faint it might easily have passed unnoticed by anyone not troubling to look for it. "This mark," she said. "I have seen it before. Not the letter, but the paper itself, or one very like it." "Where?" "At Oakridge, in your library, cataloguing the correspondence you keep filed with the estate accounts. There were letters from a banking house in the city, requesting repayment terms on some loan taken out during your father's time. The paper bore the same mark, or one so similar I would need to compare them directly to be certain." She frowned, trying to recall the details more precisely. "A lion beneath a banner. I remember thinking it a handsome design, unlike the plainer stock most correspondents arrived upon." Montgomery went very still. "Harlow and Finch," he said quietly. "My father's banking house. I have maintained the account out of habit rather than necessity these past years, though I have had little direct dealing with the firm since settling his debts." "You believe this letter comes from them?" "I believe it comes from someone with access to their stationery, which narrows the possibility considerably. Harlow and Finch is not a large concern. Perhaps a dozen men have cause to handle its private paper stock." He rose from the table, already moving toward the writing desk in the corner of the room, drawing out a fresh sheet and dipping his pen with quick, decisive motions. "This is precisely the sort of thread I hoped you might help me pull, Miss Gable. A banker with knowledge of treasonous ledgers and the discretion to threaten a duke rather than approach the crown directly is a banker with something considerable to lose should the truth surface. What will you do?" "I shall pay a visit to Harlow and Finch myself, under some pretense of ordinary business, and see which of its partners grows uneasy at my presence." He glanced up at her, something almost warm passing behind his usually guarded eyes. "You have a sharper memory for detail than half the clerks I employ, and a keener eye for pattern than most men twice your education. I begin to suspect the syndicate underestimated precisely whom they were dealing with when they let that ledger fall into your hands." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks at the praise, unaccustomed as she was to receiving it from anyone, let alone a man of Montgomery's standing. "I only noticed a mark on paper, Your Grace. It required your knowledge of the banking house to make any sense of it." Even so. He folded the letter he had been drafting and sealed it with a plain wax stamp, deliberately unmarked. "I shall send word to Bow Street, discreetly, that a watch be kept upon the White Hart these coming days, though I doubt our correspondent foolish enough to appear there in person. In the meantime, I would have you remain close to the house. Whoever sent this letter knows I have the ledger. It stands to reason they may soon learn I did not travel to London alone." The warning settled uneasily over Nora's earlier pleasure at his praise, reminding her sharply of the danger still coiled around them both, patient and unseen. "Do you believe they mean to harm me, Your Grace?" "I believe," Montgomery said carefully, "that I do not intend to give them the opportunity to try." He met her gaze steadily across the room, and something in his tone carried a weight beyond mere duty or obligation, a protectiveness that startled her with its intensity. "You have placed a great deal of trust in me since that night upon the highway, Miss Gable. Trust I have not always been certain I deserved. I do not intend to see it repaid with harm come to you." Nora held his gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, aware of some current passing between them that neither seemed quite willing to name, before the footman's return with fresh correspondence broke the silence and returned them both, reluctantly, to the business of banking houses and hidden crests, and the letter still waiting for its answer at the White Hart on Jermyn Street. The invitation arrived through a contact of Montgomery's, a Mrs. Ashworth Blackwood, a widowed heiress known for her lavish gatherings and, more usefully, her willingness to lend her home to matters requiring discretion. Her annual ball, it transpired, would draw half of London's banking and merchant families beneath one roof, Harlow and Finch among them. "You will attend as her companion for the evening," Montgomery explained, as a modiste fussed over the hem of a gown Nora had never imagined herself wearing. Pale blue silk that felt impossibly fine against skin more accustomed to rough wool. "A visiting relation from the north, newly arrived in town. No one will trouble a companion with questions, and it grants you license to move through the rooms and listen where a duke's presence alone would draw too much notice." "And what precisely am I listening for?" "Any mention of Harlow and Finch, any partner of that house who seems ill at ease in company, or who avoids conversation regarding recent business dealings. Anything that strikes you as false, in the way you noticed that watermark. You have a gift for observing what others overlook, Miss Gable. I intend to make use of it." The ballroom at Blackwood House, when they arrived that evening, exceeded anything Nora had previously imagined of such gatherings. Chandeliers blazing overhead, a small orchestra tucked into one corner, silk and velvet moving in every direction, beneath light that made the whole room glitter like something out of a story told at bedtime. She kept close to Mrs. Ashworth Blackwood at first, learning the shape of the evening, before venturing further afield as the night wore on and her nerves settled into something closer to purpose. She found Montgomery difficult to lose sight of, not because he sought her out, but because she found her own attention drifting toward him with a frequency that troubled her more than she cared to admit. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging brief words with one gentleman after another, and yet she noticed, each time she glanced his way, that his eyes found her first, before returning to whatever conversation currently occupied him. It was during her third circuit of the room that she overheard the name Harlow spoken near a cluster of gentlemen by the refreshment table, and she drifted closer under the guise of admiring a nearby painting. "Finch grows more anxious by the week," one man was saying, his voice pitched low, "ever since that courier failed to arrive with the northern accounts. Harlow himself has barely been seen at the club these past days." "Debt's catching up with him, I shouldn't wonder," another replied. "The man has always lived beyond what the firm properly earns." Nora committed every word to memory, retreating before her interest could draw notice, and made her way through the crowd in search of Montgomery. She found him near the terrace doors, in conversation with an older gentleman whose face had gone slightly grey at whatever question had just been put to him. "Mr. Harlow," Montgomery was saying, his tone deceptively mild, "I understand your firm has had a difficult season. I do hope nothing troubles the accounts I keep with you." Harlow's composure, already thin, seemed to fray further at the question. "Your Grace, I assure you every matter concerning your family's accounts remains entirely in order. If you'll forgive me, I see an acquaintance I must." He excused himself with visible haste, disappearing into the crowd before Montgomery could press further, and Nora arrived at Montgomery's side just as the banker vanished from view. "You saw that," Montgomery murmured, once she stood beside him. "I heard something more useful," she said, and relayed what she had overheard by the refreshment table. Montgomery's expression sharpened. "Then Harlow himself may be the man behind the letter, or at the very least, complicit with whoever is. A firm's reputation cannot survive rumors of debt for long, not in circles such as these. If he stood to lose everything should the ledger's contents surface, he had ample motive to see it recovered by whatever means necessary. What will you do now?" "For tonight, nothing more than watch." He glanced toward the terrace doors, where the cool night air drifted in past the heavy curtains, and something in his posture eased slightly, the tension of the evening's careful performance loosening now that a name had finally emerged from the shadows they had been chasing. "Come, you have done enough for one evening, and I would rather remove you from this room before Harlow recovers his composure enough to wonder why a duke's companion appeared so precisely wherever he stood." They stepped out onto the terrace together, the noise of the ballroom softening behind them, the London night spread out cool and star-scattered above the garden below. Nora drew her shawl closer against the chill, and Montgomery, without seeming to think twice about it, shifted his own stance slightly to shield her from the wind funneling along the stone balustrade. "You have been distracted all evening," she observed, watching him. "I have been distracted since the moment you walked into that ballroom," he admitted, with a candor that surprised them both, judging by the faint furrow that crossed his brow immediately after. "I find I attend rather less to the business at hand when I am occupied ensuring no harm comes near you in a room full of strangers." Nora's heart gave an unsteady thud at the admission, plain and unguarded in a way so unlike the composed Duke she had first met upon a rain-soaked highway weeks before. "That is not the reputation the villagers speak of, Your Grace." "No," he agreed quietly, his gaze steady upon her in the dim terrace light. "It is not." Neither of them spoke further of it, though the silence between them carried a weight neither seemed inclined to break, and when at last they returned indoors to rejoin the glittering crowd, something unspoken had settled itself firmly between them, patient and quiet, waiting for a moment less crowded with danger to be properly acknowledged. 4 days after the ball, Montgomery secured what he needed most, a legitimate reason to enter the private vaults of Harlow and Finch. A letter arrived from the firm itself, stiff with forced courtesy, inviting the Duke to review certain historical documents pertaining to his late father's accounts. A gesture meant, Nora suspected, to appear cooperative while giving Harlow the chance to learn precisely how much the Duke already knew. "You will come with me," Montgomery said, folding the letter away. "As my clerk. It is a poor disguise, but a serviceable one, and I would rather have your eyes upon those records than trust my own alone. Numbers deceive men who are not looking for deception. You have proven considerably harder to fool." The financial district, when they arrived that afternoon, felt a different city entirely from the glittering rooms of Blackwood House, Narrow streets crowded with clerks hurrying between counting houses, the air thick with the smell of ink and coal smoke, every building grey stone and iron grille, guarded as though wealth itself required fortification. Harlow and Finch occupied a squat, windowless building near the river, its vault set 2 floors below street level behind a door of solid iron. A junior clerk led them down, apologizing repeatedly for the vault's poor lighting, and left them alone among rows of ledgers and deed boxes stretching back some 40 years, promising to return within the hour once he had located the specific documents requested in Montgomery's letter. They had been working perhaps 20 minutes, Nora cross-referencing dates against entries Montgomery indicated, when she noticed the sound of the door had changed. A heavy scrape, a distinct, final click. "Your Grace." Montgomery was already moving toward the door, testing the iron handle, which did not yield beneath his grip no matter how he threw his weight against it. "It has been barred from the outside." "By the clerk?" "By someone," he said grimly, "who did not wish us examining these records without interference." He struck the door once with the flat of his hand, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the vault's thick walls, and Nora felt the first cold thread of true fear settle into her chest. Worse than anything she had experienced upon the highway weeks before, worse even than the watcher beneath the yew tree in Oakhaven. "Is there no other way out?" "None that I have found." Montgomery turned back to survey the vault, his expression tightly controlled, though Nora could see the strain beneath it. "These rooms are built to keep thieves from entering, not to allow easy exit once sealed. If Harlow intends to leave us here until we grow desperate enough to bargain, then we shall have to disappoint him," Nora said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice, and moved past Montgomery toward the door itself, running her fingers along its edge where the iron met the stone frame. "What are you doing?" "Every lock has a mechanism, Your Grace, whether it opens with a key or a bar dropped from outside. I have spent years repairing looms that jammed at the worst possible moment, and a loom's mechanism is not so very different from a door's, in principle." She traced the frame further, finding at last a narrow gap where a secondary latch, likely meant as an internal safety release for anyone trapped by accident, sat rusted nearly shut with disuse. "Here, this should release from within, if it is not seized entirely." She reached into the small pocket sewn beneath her skirt, where she had carried, out of long habit rather than any expectation of use, a slender iron pick she had once used to clear tangled thread from her loom's shuttle mechanism. Working the tool carefully into the gap, she began to ease the rusted latch free, her hands steady despite the pounding of her own heart. Montgomery crouched beside her, watching with an intensity that had nothing to do with impatience. "Where did you learn such a thing?" "Necessity, Your Grace. A weaver who cannot mend her own loom starves waiting for a man who charges more than she earns in a week to do it for her." She felt the latch shift beneath her efforts, a fraction of an inch, then further. "There, nearly." "Nora." She glanced up at the use of her given name, spoken for the first time since they had met, and found him watching her with an expression she had never before seen upon his face, something raw and unguarded, stripped of every careful composure he ordinarily wore like armor. "If we do not escape this room," he said quietly, "I would not wish to leave certain things unspoken." "We are escaping this room," she said firmly, returning her attention to the latch with renewed determination, though something in his words had lodged itself warmly beneath her ribs regardless. "Whatever you mean to say, Your Grace, you may say it once we are safely out of this vault and Harlow is made to answer for locking a duke inside his own bank." A final twist of the pick, and the latch gave way entirely with a grinding shudder, the heavy bar beyond it sliding free. Montgomery threw his shoulder against the door, and it swung open at last onto the empty corridor beyond. No sign of the clerk, or anyone else who might have sealed them within. They emerged to find the bank in a state of quiet disorder, junior clerks murmuring amongst themselves, no sign whatsoever of Harlow or the man who had led them down to the vault in the first place. "He has fled," Montgomery said grimly, surveying the empty offices, "which tells us a great deal more than any ledger could. An innocent man does not vanish the moment his guest becomes inconvenient." Nora, still catching her breath, looked up at him. "You said, in the vault, that you did not wish to leave things unspoken." Montgomery's gaze softened, the earlier urgency of their escape giving way to something quieter, more deliberate. "I did say that." He glanced around the busy corridor, clerks hurrying past on every side, entirely unsuitable surroundings for whatever he had meant to confess. Though perhaps it deserves better circumstances than a bank corridor still smelling of dust and old iron. "Perhaps it does," Nora agreed, though the warmth in her chest told her she had not entirely minded hearing even that much of it here, amid the chaos of Harlow's abandoned bank. Montgomery moved them from the Mayfair townhouse that same evening, unwilling to risk remaining anywhere Harlow's associates might think to look. The safe house in Kensington belonged, he explained, to a retired army colonel who owed him a debt of an old and private nature, a modest cottage set back from the road behind a screen of hawthorn hedges, unremarkable enough to draw no notice from anyone passing. It felt strange to Nora, after the grandeur of Blackwood House and the cold formality of the Mayfair rooms, to find herself in a house so plainly furnished, so quiet, with only a single elderly housekeeper to attend them, and a fire that crackled modestly rather than blazing in some vast marble hearth. And yet she found she preferred it, the smallness of it, the way it allowed her finally to breathe after weeks of careful performance and constant watchfulness. Montgomery found her that evening in the small parlour, seated near the window with the primer he had given her still open upon her lap, though her attention had long since drifted from the page to the darkening garden beyond the glass. "May I sit with you?" he asked, an oddly formal question from a man who had, until recently, simply commanded rather than requested. "You may, Your Grace." He settled into the chair opposite hers, and for a long moment neither spoke, the fire's soft crackle the only sound between them. It was Montgomery who finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than Nora had ever heard it. "I owe you an honesty I have avoided giving since the night we met." She set the primer aside, giving him her full attention. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I am the one who brought danger into your household, uninvited and unasked for. You brought a ledger into my carriage. The danger existed long before that, waiting for someone unlucky enough to stumble across it." He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped between his knees, and Nora thought, not for the first time, how young he looked in moments such as this, stripped of the cold authority that so often shadowed his features. "What I meant to say, in the vault, was this. I have spent a great many years believing that keeping myself apart from others, guarding every softness behind that reputation the villagers speak of, was the only way to protect what remained of my father's estate, and my own good sense besides. I told myself it was strength. I have come these past weeks to wonder whether it was only ever a kind of fear, dressed up to look like strength." "Fear of what?" "Of trusting the wrong person, as my father trusted the wrong men, and losing everything a second time. Of being seen clearly and found wanting." He met her eyes, and there was nothing guarded left in his expression now, nothing of the Duke who had first interrogated her in his study weeks before. "I did not expect, when I found you hiding beneath that travelling rug in the rain, that you would be the one to see past every wall I had built. Yet here we are, and I find I no longer wish to keep those walls between us." Nora's throat tightened, emotion rising in her chest with a suddenness that startled her. "When you first took me from that road," she said slowly, "I believed every word the villagers whispered of you. I was afraid of you, Your Grace, more afraid than I have ever been of anything in my life, save perhaps watching my family go hungry when the mill withheld my wages. And now? Now I find that fear has become something else entirely. I do not know precisely when it happened. Perhaps in your study, when you did not raise your voice, though I could offer you nothing useful. Perhaps in the carriage, teaching me my letters with more patience than I have ever received from anyone. Perhaps only tonight, watching you speak so plainly of things I suspect you have never spoken of to another living soul." She drew a steadying breath. "Whatever fear remains in me now, Your Grace, it is not fear of you." Something eased visibly in Montgomery's shoulders, a tension she suspected he had carried so long he had forgotten what its absence might feel like. "I would ask something of you, Nora, though I have little right to ask it, given everything danger and circumstance have already demanded of you these past weeks." "Ask it." "When this is finished, when Harlow and whoever stands behind him are made to answer for what they have done, I do not wish for you simply to return to Oakhaven and the life you knew before that ledger fell into your hands. I wish for you to remain, if you are willing, not as my ward, nor my librarian's assistant, but as something considerably more permanent in my household and in my regard." Nora felt tears gather, unbidden, at the careful, halting sincerity of it, so unlike anything she had imagined might ever be offered to a weaver's daughter with rough hands and no proper schooling. "You would risk your name on a girl who cannot even read a full page without stumbling." "You read 3 pages without error only this morning," Montgomery said, the faintest warmth touching his voice, something almost like the beginning of a smile. "And I would risk considerably more than my name, Nora Gable, for the chance to know you fully, without ledgers or danger standing between us." "Then I am willing," she said softly, "though I confess I do not yet know how to be anything other than afraid of how much I have come to feel for you in so short a time." "We shall learn together," Montgomery said. "Once this business with Harlow is finished, and not a moment before, I will not risk your safety by allowing my own feelings to distract me from what still stands between us and a peaceful end to this." Nora nodded, understanding the sense in it even as some part of her wished, quietly, for the danger to already be behind them, so that whatever had settled itself between them these past weeks might finally be permitted to grow into the open, unguarded, and unafraid. The message arrived on the 4th morning at Kensington, delivered by the same unremarkable method as before, a folded note left without explanation at the cottage gate, discovered by the housekeeper when she went out to collect the morning's milk. "Your Grace, enough games. Bring the ledger to the old timber warehouse at Wapping Stairs, tonight, an hour past dusk. Come alone, or do not come at all, and consider carefully what a magistrate might make of certain private matters concerning your household, should you fail to appear." Montgomery read it twice before setting it down upon the parlour table, his jaw set in the hard, controlled line Nora had not seen since the earliest days of their acquaintance. "They know of me," she said quietly, understanding the threat buried within the letter's final line. "They mean to use me against you." "They mean to try," Montgomery said. "It will not succeed. You cannot go alone. Whoever sent that note has already proven willing to trap us both inside a locked vault. What is to stop them doing far worse at an empty warehouse after dark?" "Nothing," he admitted, "which is precisely why I do not intend to go entirely alone, whatever the letter demands." He crossed to the writing desk and drew out paper and pen with quick, decisive movements. "I have maintained contact these past weeks with a man at Bow Street, discreetly, through channels Harlow's associates have no reason to suspect. Runners can be positioned near the docks without announcing their presence, close enough to intervene should matters turn dangerous, distant enough that our correspondent believes his instructions obeyed. And if he recognizes them for what they are before they can act? Then I shall have to ensure the conversation runs long enough that it does not matter," Montgomery said, though something in his voice suggested he understood the risk as clearly as she did. Dusk found them approaching Wapping Stairs by carriage, Montgomery having insisted Nora remain within it, hidden from view, while he continued the final stretch on foot toward the warehouse alone, as instructed. She watched him go from behind the carriage curtain, her heart lodged somewhere high in her throat, every instinct screaming against the sense of allowing him to walk unaccompanied into whatever waited within that looming timber structure. Inside, though she could not see it, Montgomery found the warehouse lit by a single lantern, its glow throwing long shadows across stacked crates and coiled rope, and beneath that pale light stood a man Nora would later learn was named Reeves, a syndicate agent whose composed bearing suggested considerably more danger than Harlow's frayed nerves had ever conveyed. "You came alone, Your Grace," Reeves observed. "Wise of you." "I came as instructed," Montgomery said, "though I confess I find myself curious precisely how far your instructions extend, Mr. Reeves, given that Harlow has fled London entirely, rather than answer for his part in this affair. Something flickered across Reeves's expression, quickly smoothed away. Harlow was never more than a convenient conduit. His debts made him useful. His fear now makes him a liability, and liabilities are dealt with in due course. He extended a gloved hand. "The ledger, Your Grace, if you please. I have grown considerably tired of this errand." Montgomery did not move to comply. "You threatened my household to secure this meeting. I find myself disinclined toward generosity." "You find yourself outnumbered, whatever generosity you believe yourself entitled to withhold." Reeves gestured, and two further figures emerged from the shadows at the warehouse's edges, positioning themselves near the door. "The ledger, or I promise you this evening ends considerably worse for everyone concerned, yourself included." "Very well," Montgomery said, and reached into his coat, withdrawing not the ledger itself, but a folded copy of its contents, carefully transcribed. "Before you take anything, however, you should understand precisely what you are attempting to recover, and precisely how little good it will do you now." Reeves's composure faltered slightly. "Explain yourself." "The ledger has already been fully deciphered," Montgomery said. "Every name, every transaction, every treasonous arrangement recorded within its pages has been copied, cross-referenced against public records, and delivered already into the hands of men considerably beyond your reach. Taking the original from me tonight accomplishes nothing beyond confirming, for anyone still watching this warehouse, that you and whoever employs you had every reason to want it recovered before its contents became known." "You are bluffing." "Am I?" Montgomery's voice carried none of the uncertainty the question implied. "Ask yourself, Mr. Reeves, why a duke would walk into a warehouse at Wapping Stairs after dark, alone, unless he had already ensured the outcome mattered considerably less than you have been led to believe." Outside, at that precise moment, the quiet street surrounding the warehouse erupted into sudden movement. Bow Street runners converging from positions they had held patiently since dusk, drawn forward at the signal Montgomery had arranged in advance with his contact. Nora, still watching from the carriage, saw the flash of lantern light multiply suddenly across the warehouse windows, heard shouting rise from within, and felt her whole body go rigid with fear before the warehouse doors burst open and Montgomery emerged, unharmed, flanked by two runners escorting a furious, restrained Reeves between them. She was out of the carriage before conscious thought caught up with her legs, hurrying across the cobbles toward him despite every instruction to remain hidden. "You are unhurt," she said, searching his face for any sign of injury. "Entirely unhurt," Montgomery confirmed, though his hand found hers without hesitation, gripping it with a firmness that suggested the evening's danger had shaken him considerably more than his composed bearing let show. "Reeves and his associates will answer to the magistrates for tonight's threats, and for whatever role they played in the coach's original destruction. The ledger's true contents are already beyond their reach, exactly as I told him." "You gave it to the authorities," Nora said, understanding now the plan he had kept largely to himself these past days. "Rather than using it yourself." "It was never mine to use for private gain, whatever protection or leverage it might have offered me." He looked down at her, the lantern light from the dispersing runners catching the relief plain upon his features. "Its rightful place was always with men sworn to see justice properly served, not hoarded by a duke for his own advantage. That much, at least, I learned from watching you these past weeks, Nora. Some things are worth more honestly given than cleverly kept." Around them, the warehouse yard slowly emptied of runners and their prisoners, the danger that had shadowed them since that stormy night upon the highway finally, truly, beginning to lift. They returned to Oakridge a week later, once the magistrates had concluded their initial inquiries and Montgomery had satisfied himself that Reeves, Harlow, and the men behind them would face proper account for their actions. The journey north felt entirely different from the one that had carried them south weeks before, the carriage lighter somehow, the silences between them comfortable rather than watchful. Nora had expected, upon their return, some resumption of the careful arrangement that had governed her earliest days at the estate. her small chamber off the servants' corridor, her hours spent cataloguing beneath Mrs. Pemberton's patient instruction, the invisible boundary that had once separated a duke's ward from a duke's household. Instead, she found herself shown to rooms in the family wing itself, spacious and sun-filled, overlooking the very gardens where she had first begun to understand the shape of what had grown between herself and Montgomery during their weeks in London. It was in those gardens, on a bright autumn afternoon some days after their return, that Montgomery found her seated upon a stone bench beneath the last of the season's roses, the primer he had given her weeks before open upon her lap, though she had long since outgrown its simple verses in favour of the volumes from his own library. "You have made considerable progress," he observed, settling beside her, nodding toward the book she held. "I had a patient teacher, Your Grace, whatever his reputation might once have suggested to the contrary." "I begin to suspect that reputation has suffered considerably these past weeks, at least within the walls of this household." A faint warmth touched his expression, something that had grown more frequent and less guarded with each passing day since their return. "Mrs. Pemberton informs me the entire staff now speaks of you as though you had always belonged here. I find I cannot entirely disagree with their assessment." Nora set the primer aside, turning to face him fully. "And what do you make of it yourself, Your Grace? My belonging here, I mean." "I have thought of little else these past days." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, worn slightly at its corners, the kind of object that had clearly waited a long while for its proper occasion. "I spoke to you once, in the safe house at Kensington, of wishing for you to remain in my household and in my regard, once the danger surrounding us had finally passed. I do not believe I have ever wanted anything so completely as I want that promise honored now." He opened the box to reveal a ring, simply set, a single stone catching the afternoon light with a warmth that matched the color rising in Nora's own cheeks. "I am not a man given easily to sentiment, Nora Gable. You have known me cold and controlled, guarded against every softness, for longer than you have known whatever gentler nature lay hidden beneath it. But you found that nature regardless, in a carriage upon a storm-battered road, in a courtyard where you refused to fear my temper, in a locked vault where your steady hands accomplished what my own strength could not. I would have you remain at Oakridge not as my ward, nor merely as the woman I have come to trust above all others, but as my equal, and as my wife, should you find yourself willing to accept a man who took considerably longer than he should have to recognize what stood plainly before him." Nora's eyes filled, though the tears that gathered there carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had marked so much of their weeks together since that first frightened night in his carriage. "I came to Oakridge a debtor's daughter, with nothing to offer beyond a stolen ledger and a great deal of misplaced desperation, Your Grace. I have often wondered these past weeks what a man of your standing could possibly see in someone so far beneath him. I have seen a woman who corrected my steward without fear, who noticed a watermark that eluded trained clerks, who freed us both from a locked vault with nothing more than a mechanic's instinct and a steady hand, who spoke honestly to me when every other soul in this household spoke only what they believed I wished to hear." Montgomery took her hand gently, turning it palm upward, tracing the calluses years of loom work had left there with something close to reverence. "I have seen, Nora, precisely the woman I did not know I was searching for until she appeared, quite by accident, hiding beneath a traveling rug during the worst storm of the season. Standing has very little to do with what I feel for you. It never truly has." "Then my answer is yes," Nora said, her voice unsteady with an emotion too large and too long awaited to contain. "Though I confess I still cannot read every word in your library, Your Grace, and I suspect I shall need a patient teacher for some years yet to come." "A patient teacher you shall have," Montgomery said, slipping the ring gently onto her finger, "for as many years as you will permit me the privilege." News of the betrothal spread through Oakridge and beyond within days, carried first by the delighted staff and then, inevitably, to the villages scattered across the surrounding countryside, including Oakhaven itself, where Nora's mother received the news with tears of her own and an invitation, extended personally by Montgomery, to visit the estate whenever she wished. her family's old debts quietly settled and forgotten. The conspiracy that had once threatened them both had been dismantled entirely, its architects made to answer before the proper authorities. The danger that had shadowed their every step since that stormy night upon the highway finally, completely lifted. What remained in its place was something Montgomery had not permitted himself in a great many years: a household filled with warmth rather than cold formality, a duchy governed with justice rather than mere fear, and a partnership built not upon the ledger that had first brought them together, but upon everything steady and true that had grown between them in the weeks since. In the gardens at Vansford, beneath the last roses of a fading autumn, the Duke, once feared by all of northern England, sat beside the woman who had taught him, gently and without ever intending to, that strength and gentleness had never truly been opposites at all.